I buried my husband on a Tuesday morning in April, and by Thursday afternoon, my son-in-law was already measuring the curtains in our beach house. I'm not being dramatic. I actually saw him do it. Standing there in our Malibu living room with one of those little metal tape measures, jotting numbers into his phone like he was planning a renovation. My daughter Ashley stood beside him, her eyes red from crying, but not so red that she couldn't discuss paint samples. That's when I knew. That's when I understood that the next chapter of my life wasn't going to be about grief. It was going to be about survival. Before you judge me for what I did next, let me know where you're watching this from. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or if you've ever watched someone you loved turn into someone you didn't recognize, stay with me. There are more stories like this in the description box below. Stories about people like us. People who had to learn the hard way that family isn't always blood, and love isn't always loyal. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old now, but I was 65 when this all started. I'd spent 43 years married to Robert, a man who built an empire from nothing. We started with a single property, a rundown cabin in eastern Kentucky that his grandfather left him. Everyone thought we were crazy when we kept it, when we poured money into preserving it instead of selling it for whatever we could get. But Robert had vision. He saw what that land could become. And over the decades, we turned his grandfather's legacy into something extraordinary. We built carefully, strategically. 4 beachfront properties in California, each one more valuable than the last. Robert was meticulous about everything, especially about planning for the future. We had wills. We had trusts. We had conversations late at night about what would happen when one of us was gone. But here's the thing about plans. They only work if everyone plays by the rules. Ashley was our only child. Our miracle baby, born after years of trying, after doctors told us it would never happen. We spoiled her. God, did we spoil her. Private schools, study abroad programs, a wedding that cost more than most people's houses. She married Bradley when she was 28. He was 32, a pharmaceutical sales rep with a megawatt smile and an Audi he couldn't quite afford. Robert had reservations. He never said it outright, but I could see it in the way he watched Bradley at family dinners. The way his jaw would tighten when Bradley talked about investments he hadn't made yet, or opportunities he was definitely going to capitalize on. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that every father thinks no man is good enough for his daughter. But the truth was there, hiding in plain sight. Bradley didn't love Ashley. He loved what Ashley represented. Access. Proximity to wealth. A safety net that would catch him no matter how many times he stumbled. The real shift happened about 6 months before Robert died. We were all together at the Laguna Beach house, the crown jewel of our California properties. Dinner on the terrace, sunset melting into the Pacific. Bradley kept steering the conversation toward estate planning. Not subtly either. He wanted to know about the properties. Who would get what? Had we considered putting things in Ashley's name now, for tax purposes? Robert shut him down, but gently. He said we had everything handled. That we'd worked with the best attorneys money could buy. I remember the look on Bradley's face. Not disappointment. Calculation. Like he was already running numbers in his head, already strategizing his next move. Ashley just sipped her wine and stared at the ocean. She barely spoke anymore unless Bradley prompted her. My vibrant, opinionated daughter had become a mirror, reflecting whatever her husband wanted to see. After Robert's funeral, they stayed in California. Said they wanted to be close, to help me through the difficult transition. But help isn't the right word for what happened next. Bradley started going through Robert's office. He told me he was looking for insurance documents, for account information I might need. But I caught him photographing files. I caught him on Robert's computer, trying passwords. When I confronted him, he smiled that smile. The one that made my skin crawl. He said he was just trying to help me get organized. Ashley defended him. Of course she did. She said I was being paranoid, that grief was making me see things that weren't there. She said Bradley was only trying to protect me from the overwhelming details of Robert's estate. But I knew what I'd seen. And more importantly, I knew what Robert had told me 3 weeks before he died. We were in the Kentucky cabin. Robert had insisted on going, even though his health was failing. He wanted to see it one more time, he said. Walk the property. Sit on the porch and watch the fog roll through the mountains. On our last night there, he held my hand and told me he'd changed the will. He'd made adjustments. He said I needed to trust the process, that everything would make sense when the time came. He made me promise not to tell Ashley or Bradley anything. Not yet. I didn't understand then. But I was about to. If you're still with me, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. I promise you, this story goes places you won't expect. And check the description for more stories about family secrets and the moment everything changes. Because mine was coming fast. The estate reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. Robert's attorney, Kenneth Morrison, had been with us for over 20 years. He was methodical, thorough, and completely unreadable. The meeting was set for 10 in the morning at his downtown office. Ashley and Bradley arrived early. I could see them through the glass walls of the conference room, heads bent together, whispering. When I walked in, they barely looked up. Kenneth laid out the documents with surgical precision. Water glasses positioned just so. Folders aligned. He had this way of moving that made you understand he was in complete control of the room. Bradley sat forward in his chair, fingers drumming against the mahogany table. Ashley kept smoothing her skirt, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Kenneth began with the formalities. Expressed condolences. Explained the process. Then he started reading. The beach properties came first. All 4 of them. Laguna Beach. Santa Monica. Carmel by the Sea. Monterey. Each one worth millions. And according to the will Kenneth was reading, each one was being left in trust to Ashley. Bradley's face lit up like Christmas morning. He actually reached over and squeezed Ashley's hand, leaning back in his chair with this look of pure triumph. Ashley's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad tears anymore. They were relief. Validation. The confirmation that she'd been the golden daughter all along. But I wasn't crying. I was watching Kenneth's face. And I saw the smallest flicker of something. Not quite a smile. More like satisfaction. Because we hadn't gotten to the Kentucky property yet. Kenneth turned the page with deliberate slowness. I could feel Bradley's energy in the room, this electric current of smugness that made my teeth ache. He thought he'd won. He thought the hard part was over and now it was just a matter of logistics, of transferring deeds and updating bank accounts. He was already planning how to spend money he didn't have yet. I could see it in his eyes. Kenneth cleared his throat. The sound cut through the room like a knife. He said that according to Robert's wishes, Margaret, that's me, would retain ownership of the family cabin in Harlan County, Kentucky, along with the surrounding 53 acres. The room went quiet. Not a contemplative quiet. A dismissive one. Like Kenneth had just announced that I'd inherited a used television. That's when Bradley made his move. He sat forward again, lacing his fingers together on the table in this pose that I'm sure he thought made him look thoughtful. Concerned. He said, and I remember his exact words, he said, my mother-in-law left us the 4 beachfront properties in California. Sorry, looks like you only got that old cabin in Kentucky. The words hung in the air. I could feel Ashley shift beside him, uncomfortable but not enough to contradict him. He kept going. Said that of course I was welcome to visit the beach houses anytime. That they'd make sure I had a standing invitation. He actually used the word generous. Said they were going to be generous with me. The room erupted in whispers. Kenneth's paralegal glanced up from her notes. Even Kenneth's assistant, a woman who'd probably seen every kind of family drama play out in that conference room, raised her eyebrows. But I didn't react. Not the way they expected. I didn't argue or cry or demand an explanation. I simply smiled. Then I turned to my daughter and said, "You never actually visited it, did you?" Ashley's face went blank. That lost look she used to get as a child when she couldn't find something she was sure she'd left in plain sight. Bradley's expression changed completely. The smugness drained away, replaced by something sharper. Confusion. Maybe the first whisper of fear. He demanded to know what I meant. Visited. What exactly? I didn't answer right away. I let the question sit there between us, heavy and loaded. Kenneth was watching me now with something that might have been approval. Or maybe just professional curiosity about how this was going to unfold. I could feel my heart pounding, but my voice stayed steady. I told them they should probably visit before they started celebrating. That Robert had been very specific about his wishes. That there were things they needed to understand. Bradley's face went pale. Actually pale. The color drained from his cheeks like someone had pulled a plug. He started to argue, to demand specifics, but Kenneth interrupted. Said that all the terms of the will would be made clear in due course. That there were additional documents that needed to be reviewed. That everyone should take some time to process before making any decisions. But Bradley wasn't having it. He wanted answers now. He turned to me with this look, this barely contained fury that he was trying to dress up as concern. Asked me what I was talking about. What game I was playing. Ashley touched his arm, tried to calm him down, but he shook her off. For the first time since she'd married him, I saw her flinch. That's when Kenneth did something I'll never forget. He pulled out a second folder. A thin one, maybe 10 pages total. He said that Robert had left specific instructions to be conveyed only after the initial reading of the will. That these instructions pertained to the Kentucky property and its relationship to the California holdings. He said that before anyone could take possession of their inheritance, there were conditions that needed to be met. The word conditions hit Bradley like a slap. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Started pacing. Said this was ridiculous, that you couldn't put conditions on an inheritance, that we'd be hearing from his attorney. Kenneth didn't even blink. Just said that actually, yes, you absolutely could place conditions on an inheritance, and that Robert's instructions were airtight. That he'd been very thorough. I watched my daughter's face as this played out. She was starting to understand that something was wrong. That the victory lap Bradley had been running in his head wasn't going to happen. She asked, in this small voice that reminded me so much of the little girl she used to be, she asked what kind of conditions. Kenneth looked at me. I nodded. He explained that Robert had structured the inheritance so that the California properties were held in an irrevocable trust. That Ashley was named as the primary beneficiary, yes, but that the trust had very specific terms. Terms that included mandatory visits to the Kentucky property. Documentation of those visits. And most importantly, an appraisal clause that would be triggered upon Robert's death. Bradley stopped pacing. An appraisal clause? For what? That cabin is worth nothing. The silence that followed was delicious. I shouldn't have enjoyed it as much as I did, but after months of watching this man manipulate my daughter, after seeing him pour through my dead husband's office like a grave robber, I felt entitled to the moment. I told him that was exactly the problem. He'd assumed. He'd never asked questions. Never showed genuine interest in Robert's work or his legacy. He'd seen dollar signs in California and dismissed everything else as irrelevant. Kenneth laid it out then. The full picture. The Kentucky property, the cabin that everyone thought was just a sentimental holdover from Robert's childhood, sat on 53 acres of pristine Appalachian land. Land that had been surveyed 6 months before Robert died. Land that contained one of the largest untapped natural spring systems in the eastern United States. Land that 3 different beverage companies had been quietly negotiating to purchase for the past 2 years. The cabin wasn't worthless. It was worth more than all 4 California properties combined. Robert had known. He'd always known. The appraisals were in the folder Kenneth held. $18 million. Conservative estimate. Could go higher depending on development rights and water extraction permits. And according to the terms of Robert's will, I had sole decision-making power over whether to sell, develop, or preserve the property. The California properties? Those were tied up in the trust with so many restrictions that Ashley and Bradley couldn't touch them without my approval for at least 10 years. I wish I could describe the look on Bradley's face. It was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse in real time. Ashley started crying, but these were different tears now. She was realizing what she'd missed. What she'd ignored. All those times Robert had tried to talk to her about the Kentucky land, about his plans, about the legacy he was building. She'd been too busy looking at ocean views to see the mountain in front of her. If this is hitting home for any of you, if you've ever been underestimated or dismissed, leave a comment. Tell me your story. And please, check the description box for more stories about justice, revenge, and the moment the tables turn. Because mine was just beginning. Bradley tried to recover. Started talking fast, saying this was great news, that we should all celebrate, that of course they'd always valued the Kentucky property. But his voice was shaking. His hands were shaking. Kenneth gathered his papers and said that we'd reconvene in 1 week to discuss the specifics of the trust administration. That everyone should take time to review the documents and consider their options. As we left the conference room, Bradley grabbed my arm. Not hard, but firm enough to stop me. He said we needed to talk. That there had been a misunderstanding. That he'd never meant to imply the cabin was worthless. I pulled my arm away gently and told him that we didn't need to talk. That Robert had made his wishes very clear. That I would honor those wishes exactly as he'd intended. Ashley followed me to the parking lot. She was sobbing now, full-body sobs that made her shoulders shake. She said she was sorry. That she should have paid more attention. That she should have visited the cabin when Robert asked. I wanted to hold her. Every instinct I had as a mother wanted to pull her close and tell her it was okay. But it wasn't okay. And she needed to understand that. I told her that her father had loved her more than anything in this world. That everything he'd built was meant to provide for her future. But that he'd also seen what I'd seen. That Bradley didn't love her. He loved security. And that until she could see the difference, until she could value substance over surface, she wasn't ready for the responsibility Robert had tried to give her. She asked me what I was going to do. With the land. With the money. With everything. I told her I didn't know yet. That I needed time to think. To grieve. To figure out who I was without Robert beside me. Then I got in my car and drove away, leaving both of them standing in the parking lot of Kenneth's office building, looking lost and small against the Los Angeles skyline. But the story doesn't end there. Because what I didn't tell them, what I didn't tell anyone, was that Robert had left me one more thing. One final gift that would change everything. I drove straight to the Kentucky cabin. Didn't pack a bag, didn't tell anyone where I was going. Just got on the highway and kept driving until the palm trees turned to pine forests and the ocean smell was replaced by mountain air. It took me 3 days. I stopped at motels with names like Mountain View Inn and Traveler's Rest, places where nobody asked questions and the coffee was always too weak. I needed the time. The distance. The silence. The cabin sat exactly where it always had, tucked into a hollow with the ridge rising behind it like a protective hand. Robert's grandfather had built it in 1947 with timber cut from the property. 3 rooms, a wraparound porch, and windows that framed the mountains like paintings. We'd upgraded over the years. New roof, better insulation, a kitchen that actually functioned, but the bones of the place remained unchanged. It looked humble. Unremarkable. Exactly what Bradley had assumed it was. I'd been there alone maybe 3 times in my entire marriage. Robert had always come with me, or we'd brought Ashley when she was young. But standing on that porch by myself, key in hand, I felt something shift. This place was mine now. Mine to protect. Mine to decide about. The weight of that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Inside, everything was exactly as we'd left it. Robert's jacket still hanging on the hook by the door. Coffee mugs in the dish drainer. A book on the side table, bookmark holding his place in a biography of Theodore Roosevelt he'd never finish. I let myself cry then. Really cry, for the first time since he died. Not the polite, contained tears I'd shed at the funeral. The ugly, gasping kind that leave you hollow and exhausted. When I could breathe again, I did what I'd come there to do. I went to Robert's desk in the corner of the main room. It was an old oak piece, scarred and solid, with drawers that stuck when you pulled them. The bottom drawer had a false bottom. Robert had shown it to me years ago, a hiding place his grandfather had built to keep important papers safe during lean times. I'd forgotten about it until Kenneth mentioned that Robert had left me specific instructions. I found the envelope exactly where Robert said it would be. Thick manila paper, my name written in his careful handwriting. Inside were 3 letters and a smaller sealed envelope marked "Open Last." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unfold the first letter. The first one was dated 3 months before he died. He wrote that he knew I'd be angry with him for keeping secrets. That he'd struggled with how much to tell me and when. But that he'd needed to protect me from the weight of knowing while he was still alive. He said Bradley had come to him privately, 6 months earlier, asking for a loan. Said he had an investment opportunity that couldn't miss. Robert had refused, gently at first, then more firmly when Bradley kept pushing. That's when Bradley's true colors showed. He'd said things. Ugly things. About how Robert owed it to Ashley to help her husband succeed. About how Robert was holding them back by being so controlling with his money. Robert wrote that he'd considered confronting Ashley about it, but he could see that she was already so deep in Bradley's influence that she wouldn't hear him. So instead, he did what he did best. He planned. He revised the will. He made sure that the people he loved would be protected, even from their own poor judgment. The second letter was shorter. Instructions about the property. He'd been in negotiations with a company called Clearwater Springs Corporation. They wanted to purchase the water rights but allow us to retain the land. The deal was worth $12 million upfront, with ongoing royalties that could total another $15 million over 20 years. He'd been finalizing terms when he got sick. The paperwork was with Kenneth. All I had to do was sign. But then came the third letter. The one that changed everything. Robert wrote that he'd hired a private investigator. That he'd needed to know exactly who Bradley was before making final decisions about the estate. What the investigator found was worse than Robert had imagined. Bradley was already married when he met Ashley. Had been for 2 years, to a woman named Jennifer living in Phoenix. He'd never divorced her. The marriage to Ashley wasn't legal. Wasn't real. Bradley was a bigamist. More than that, Bradley had been systematically draining Ashley's personal accounts. She had a trust fund from Robert's parents, something she'd come into at 25. It had been worth about $400,000. By the time Robert discovered the truth, there was less than $30,000 left. Bradley had convinced her to give him access for joint investments. He'd lost it all in bad trades and worse decisions, then lied about the returns. Robert wrote that he'd confronted Bradley with this information 2 weeks before he died. Told him that if Bradley didn't leave Ashley and disappear within 6 months, Robert would turn everything over to the police and make sure Bradley went to prison for fraud and bigamy. Bradley had agreed. Had actually agreed. But then Robert got sicker faster than expected, and Bradley must have calculated that he could outlast Robert's threats. That once Robert was gone, there'd be no one to hold him accountable. Except Robert had documented everything. Copies of the investigator's report, bank statements, even recorded conversations. All of it was in Kenneth's safe, along with instructions to release the information to authorities if Bradley was still in Ashley's life 6 months after Robert's death. I sat on the floor of that cabin, letters scattered around me, and felt the full weight of what Robert had done. He'd tried to save our daughter even as he was dying. He'd built a trap that would either force Bradley to run or catch him red-handed. The Kentucky property, the will structure, the trust conditions, none of it was really about money. It was about buying time. Time for Ashley to see the truth. Time for Bradley's house of cards to collapse. The last envelope contained a single sentence: make him confess. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Really. These stories matter because they remind us that we're not alone in our struggles. That sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we trusted completely. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and check the description for more stories about betrayal, revelation, and what happens when the truth finally comes out. Because my truth was about to explode. I called Kenneth from the cabin landline. Cell service was spotty in the mountains, but the old rotary phone still worked. I told him I'd found the letters. He asked if I'd read them all. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, then asked what I wanted to do. I told him exactly what Robert had asked me to do. Make Bradley confess. Kenneth said he'd schedule another meeting. that he'd make sure everyone was there. I spent the next 2 weeks at the cabin, walking the property, sitting by the spring that Robert had found so valuable, thinking about 43 years of marriage and how much I still didn't know about the man I'd loved. He'd carried so much alone, protected me from so much. And now it was my turn to carry something for him, to finish what he'd started. I also called the first Mrs. Bradley, Jennifer. The investigator's report had included her number. She answered on the third ring, and when I explained who I was, there was a long silence. Then she said 5 words that told me everything. I've been waiting for this call. We talked for 2 hours. She told me her story. How Bradley had charmed her, married her, then slowly isolated her from her family. How he'd drained her savings too. How she'd finally gotten the courage to kick him out, but he'd refused to sign divorce papers. Said he'd do it eventually but kept stalling. She'd lost track of him about 5 years ago. Didn't know he'd remarried. Was shocked to learn he'd targeted another family. I asked if she'd be willing to testify if it came to that. She said she'd been hoping someone would ask. That she'd wanted justice for years but didn't have the resources to pursue it alone. I told her that was about to change. The meeting was set for a Friday afternoon. Same conference room. Same players. But this time, I'd invited 2 additional guests. Jennifer. And a detective from the fraud division of the LAPD. Kenneth had arranged everything, working with Robert's investigator to present the case in a way that law enforcement couldn't ignore. Ashley and Bradley arrived together, but they weren't holding hands anymore. I could see the strain between them. The questions she must have been asking. The lies he must have been scrambling to maintain. They sat down across from me, and Bradley tried to smile. Tried to pretend this was just another business meeting. But his eyes kept darting to the door. Some animal instinct was telling him to run. Kenneth began formally. Said that new information had come to light regarding the estate. That there were irregularities that needed to be addressed before any inheritance could be distributed. Bradley started to interrupt, but Kenneth held up a hand. Said he'd be given a chance to speak. But first, there were people he needed to meet. Jennifer walked in first. I watched Bradley's face go through every stage of panic. Denial, recognition, calculation, fear. Ashley looked confused, glancing between them. She asked who this woman was. Jennifer introduced herself. Said she was Bradley's wife. Ashley laughed. Said that was impossible, that she was Bradley's wife. Jennifer said she was sorry, but she'd been married to Bradley since 2016. Had the marriage certificate to prove it. The room felt like it was shrinking. I could actually see Bradley calculating whether he could make it to the door before anyone stopped him. But the detective was standing right there, arms crossed, blocking the exit. Ashley was shaking. Not crying yet. Just shaking, like her body couldn't process what it was hearing. She kept saying no over and over, this small voice that broke my heart even as I knew this had to happen. Jennifer laid it all out. Showed the marriage certificate. Showed photos of them together, dated and timestamped. Showed the restraining order she'd eventually filed when Bradley had gotten violent during their last argument about money. Ashley turned to look at her husband then, and I saw the exact moment something died in her eyes. Not love. She'd probably lost that months ago without realizing it. This was hope. The hope that maybe she'd been wrong, that maybe I'd been paranoid, that maybe her marriage was real. Bradley finally found his voice. Started stammering about how it was a misunderstanding, how Jennifer was lying, how she was clearly working with me to destroy him. But his voice had no conviction. He was going through the motions of denial because that's what he'd always done, but there was no energy behind it. He'd been caught, and somewhere in his reptile brain, he knew it was over. Kenneth placed another folder on the table. This one was thick. He said it contained 5 years of financial records. Ashley's trust fund transactions. Bank statements showing the systematic withdrawal of her money. Brokerage accounts that Bradley had opened in her name without her knowledge. Investment losses that didn't exist. The money had simply disappeared into Bradley's personal accounts. The detective took notes while Kenneth walked through each transaction. Ashley picked up the bank statements with trembling hands. I could see her scanning the numbers, trying to make sense of how $400,000 had evaporated. She asked Bradley in this tiny voice, she asked if it was true. If he'd taken her money. He tried to reach for her hand. She pulled away so violently she knocked over her water glass. Nobody moved to clean it up. We all just watched the water spread across the polished table like a stain. That's when Bradley turned on me. His last desperate play. He said this was all my doing, that I'd poisoned Ashley against him from the beginning, that I'd never given him a fair chance. That Robert had been the same way, looking down on him, making him feel small. He actually said that Robert got what he deserved for being so controlling. The words hung there, vile and exposed. I didn't yell. Didn't cry. I simply opened my purse and pulled out a small recording device. Robert's investigator had given it to me along with the letters. It contained the conversation between Robert and Bradley, 2 weeks before Robert died. I pressed play. Robert's voice filled the room. Weak but clear. Telling Bradley he knew everything. The bigamy. The theft. The lies. Bradley's voice responding, first defensive, then angry, then calculating. Saying things I won't repeat here because they'd hurt Ashley even more than she was already hurting. But the worst part was at the end. Bradley saying he'd just wait Robert out. That old man died all the time. That once Robert was gone, there'd be nobody to stop him from taking everything. The recording ended. The silence was absolute. Ashley stood up. Walked to the window. Stared out at the city her father had worked so hard to provide for her. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Older. Harder. She asked the detective what happened next. The detective explained that Bradley would be arrested for fraud and bigamy. That the district attorney's office was already preparing charges. That restitution would be part of any plea deal, but realistically, Ashley shouldn't expect to recover her lost money. Bradley would likely serve 3 to 5 years if convicted. Jennifer had already agreed to testify. The case was airtight. Bradley tried one last time. Turned to Ashley and said he loved her. That everything he'd done was for them, for their future. That he'd made mistakes, but they could fix this together. Ashley didn't even look at him. She told him to stop talking. Told him that she didn't know who he was, maybe never had. Then she asked Kenneth what she needed to do to dissolve the marriage that apparently didn't exist anyway. The detective arrested Bradley right there in the conference room. Read him his rights while Kenneth's paralegal called building security. Bradley kept talking the whole time, words spilling out in a desperate stream, but nobody was listening anymore. When they let him out in handcuffs, he looked back at me one last time. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see that I wasn't afraid of him. That he'd underestimated the wrong family. After he was gone, Ashley finally broke down. Full sobs, the kind that sound like they're being ripped out of you. I went to her then, wrapped my arms around her, and let her cry on my shoulder the way she used to when she was little. We stood there for a long time, Jennifer and Kenneth and the paralegal quietly gathering papers around us, giving us space to grieve for different things. Ashley was grieving her marriage, her trust, her sense of reality. I was grieving the years I'd lost doubting myself, wondering if I was imagining Bradley's manipulation. When Ashley could finally speak, she asked if I could forgive her. For not listening. For not visiting the cabin when Robert asked. For choosing Bradley over her own parents. I told her there was nothing to forgive. That Bradley had been good at what he did. That manipulation works because it's gradual, invisible until you're so deep you can't see daylight. I told her that her father loved her. That everything he'd done, including the painful way he'd structured the will, was to protect her. She asked about the Kentucky property. What I was going to do with it. I told her about the Clearwater Springs deal. About the $18 million that was sitting there, waiting. She said I deserved it. That I should take the money and live the life I wanted. But I had other plans. I signed the deal with Clearwater Springs the following week. $12 million upfront, plus royalties. I put $6 million in a trust for Ashley with strict conditions. She couldn't access the principal until she'd completed therapy and demonstrated financial independence for at least 2 years. I wanted her to rebuild herself from the inside out, Not just paper over Bradley's damage with money. 2 million went to Jennifer. She'd lost years to Bradley too, and she deserved a chance to start over. She cried when I told her. Said nobody had ever just believed her before, let alone compensated her for what she'd lost. We stay in touch now. She's back in school, studying to become a therapist. Says she wants to help other women recognize the signs of financial abuse. The remaining 4 million I split between charitable foundations, organizations that support women escaping domestic situations, financial literacy programs, resources for people rebuilding their lives after betrayal. Robert would have liked that. He always said money was a tool, and tools were meant to build things. As for the California properties, Ashley and I worked with Kenneth to restructure the trust. She didn't want them anymore. Said they reminded her of Bradley, of who she'd been when she was with him. We sold 3 of them. The 4th, the Laguna Beach house, we kept. But not as a personal residence. We converted it into a transitional housing facility for women and children escaping abuse. Ashley manages it now. Throws herself into the work like she's trying to atone for something, though I keep telling her she has nothing to atone for. Bradley pleaded guilty eventually. Got 4 years, served 2 before being paroled. I heard through Jennifer that he left California after his release. Moved back east somewhere. Started over with a new name and probably a new target. Some people never learn. But that's not my problem anymore. Ashley asks me sometimes if I think Robert knew how it would all turn out. If he'd planned every move, every revelation, every consequence. I tell her I don't know. That your father was brilliant, but he wasn't psychic. But the truth is, I think he did know. Not the details, maybe, but the shape of it. He knew that Bradley would overplay his hand. That greed always does. He knew that the cabin, dismissed and underestimated, would be the thing that exposed the truth. And he knew that I'd be strong enough to see it through. I live in Kentucky now. Kept the cabin and the land, though I let Clearwater manage the spring operations. Built a small house on the ridge above the hollow where I can watch the seasons change. Ashley visits once a month. Brings her therapist's homework and her questions, and slowly, carefully, we're rebuilding what we lost. Not the mother-daughter relationship we had before. Something different. More honest. Built on the understanding that love isn't about protecting people from pain. It's about standing with them while they learn to bear it. On clear nights, I sit on my porch and look at the stars. The same stars Robert looked at when he was a boy visiting his grandfather's cabin. The same stars he looked at 3 weeks before he died, when he made me promise to trust the process. I wish I could tell him that I understand now. That his last gift wasn't the money or the property. It was the truth. And the courage to face it. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for walking this path with me. It wasn't easy to tell. Wasn't easy to live through. But maybe it helps to know that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. That sometimes the people who hurt us most also teach us how strong we really are. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And please, check the description box below for more stories about survival, justice, and the unexpected ways life brings us full circle. Because if there's one thing I've learned in my 68 years, it's that the truth always finds a way to surface. Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like. Sometimes it costs more than we think we can bear. But it comes. And when it does, we get to choose who we become in its light. I never expected to be the woman sitting on a Kentucky porch, watching the fog roll through the mountains at dawn, content in a silence I once would have called loneliness. I never expected to lose my husband and my daughter's innocence in the same year. I never expected to discover that the man I'd loved for 43 years had been carrying secrets heavy enough to break most people. But I also never expected to find out how much strength lives in the quiet spaces. How much power there is in simply refusing to look away when the truth gets ugly. How much healing can happen when you stop trying to control the story and just let it unfold. Ashley called me last week. Said she'd met someone. Nothing serious yet, just coffee and conversation. But she wanted me to know. Wanted my opinion. I told her I was proud of her for taking it slow. For trusting herself enough to be cautious. She laughed and said her therapist would be pleased to hear that. Then she got quiet and said she'd been thinking about her dad a lot lately. About how he'd tried to protect her even when it meant letting her be angry with him. I told her that's what real love looks like sometimes. Not the fairy tale version where everything is easy and everyone gets along. The messy version where you make hard choices and live with the consequences because you know it's right. She said she thought she was finally starting to understand that. That she wished she could tell him. I said he knows. Somehow, wherever he is, he knows. And he's proud of the woman she's becoming. The one who runs a shelter and shows up for therapy and takes things slow with men she meets. The one who visits her mother once a month and sits on the porch talking about everything and nothing until the stars come out. We're not fixed. Neither of us. You don't fix something like what we went through. But we're healing. And maybe that's better. Maybe being fixed means you can break again, but being healed means you've learned how to put yourself back together. I think about Bradley sometimes, though not as often as I used to. Wonder if he ever thinks about what he lost. Not the money or the properties or the opportunities. But the chance to be part of something real. To be loved by people who would have moved mountains for him if he'd just been honest. I hope he does think about it. I hope it keeps him up at night. But mostly, I just hope he stays far away from anyone else who might fall for his charm. The Clearwater Springs royalties came through last month. Another check that I honestly don't need. I'm thinking about starting a scholarship fund. Something for kids from Eastern Kentucky who want to go to college but don't have the means. Robert would have liked that. He always said that the best revenge against people who underestimate you is to prove them wrong by lifting up the next generation. Jennifer's scholarship program is thriving, by the way. She graduated top of her class and already has a small practice going. Specializes in financial trauma and gaslighting recovery. Says her experience with Bradley was the worst thing that ever happened to her and also the thing that gave her purpose. I understand that completely. Sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest strengths, if we're willing to do the work of transformation. The cabin itself has become something of a sanctuary. I've had other women stay here, friends of friends, strangers from Ashley's shelter who need space to breathe and think. There's something about these mountains that puts things in perspective. Makes you realize how small your problems are in the grand scheme of geological time. How many storms these ridges have weathered. How many seasons have turned while the spring kept flowing, steady and sure, regardless of human drama. I planted a garden last spring. Tomatoes, beans, squash, all the things Robert's grandmother grew when this was still their homestead. There's something deeply satisfying about pulling food from the earth you own. About sitting on your porch eating a tomato still warm from the sun, knowing that nobody can take this from you. That you built something real here. Something that will outlast you. People in town know me now. The woman from California who came back to the old Johnson place. They were skeptical at first. Outsiders always are in places like this, but they've warmed up. I shop at the local market, attend the occasional church potluck, volunteer at the library. I'm becoming part of the fabric here in a way I never was in California, where we were always just people passing through, temporary residents in a temporary place. There's a young couple who bought the property adjacent to mine. Sarah and Tom. Late 20s, full of dreams about sustainable farming and simple living. They remind me of Robert and me when we were young, before the empire building, when it was just about making something with your hands and your heart. I've been teaching Sarah how to can vegetables. She teaches me about solar panels and rainwater collection. It's a fair trade. Last month, on what would have been Robert's 70th birthday, Ashley came to visit. Brought flowers and a bottle of good bourbon. We hiked up to the ridge where I'd scattered some of his ashes, and we toasted him as the sun set over the mountains. Ashley told him out loud that she understood now. That she was sorry it took so long. That she was trying to live in a way that would make him proud. I told him thank you. For the years we had. For the way he loved me. For the impossible position he'd been put in at the end and the grace with which he'd handled it. For trusting me to finish what he started. For the cabin that turned out to be so much more than a cabin. We stayed up there until the stars came out. Full dark in the mountains is different than anywhere else. Absolute, enveloping, alive with sounds you can't quite identify. Ashley said she understood now why her dad loved this place. Why he kept coming back even when it would have been easier to stay in California. She said she felt closer to him here than anywhere else. I know what she means. Sometimes I swear I can feel him in the breeze that moves through the pines. In the way the light hits the porch at dawn. In the steady, patient flow of the spring that made all of this possible. He's not here, not really. But the best parts of him are. The vision. The planning. The love that expressed itself in protection and preparation rather than empty words. So here I am. 68 years old, living in a cabin in Kentucky, wealthy beyond anything I need, surrounded by mountains that have seen everything and judged nothing. It's not the life I planned when I was 25 and marrying an ambitious young man with calloused hands and big dreams. But it's the life I have. And maybe, just maybe, it's the life I was always meant to find. If you're watching this from somewhere that feels impossible right now, from a relationship that's crushing you, from a situation that seems like it will never change, from a place of grief or betrayal or loss so deep you can't see light, I want you to know something. You're stronger than you think. And the story isn't over yet. The chapters that break you are often the ones that remake you into someone you never imagined you could be. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. For walking through the hard parts and staying until the end. Please, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And check the description box below for more stories about resilience, revenge, and redemption. About people who refused to stay victims. About families that rebuilt themselves from the ashes of betrayal. About love that looks different than we expected but turns out to be exactly what we needed. And if you're still here, if you made it all the way to this sentence, do me one last favor. Take a breath. Feel it fill your lungs. Remember that you're alive, that you survived every moment that tried to break you, and that tomorrow is still waiting with possibilities you can't yet imagine. The fog is rolling in now. Time to go inside, pour that glass of bourbon I keep meaning to drink, and sit by the fire with a good book. The mountains will be here in the morning. The spring will keep flowing. And I'll wake up to another day of this unexpected, hard-won, beautiful life. Thank you for being here. Until next time.